Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Today, a great number of people are working from home, more people than ever in history. But it's important to remember that a great number of people are also returning to the office, and many are embracing the hybrid type of work where they work partly at home and partly at the office. Just as it was a big adjustment for many to all of a sudden start working from home when the pandemic hit, it's now equally an adjustment to return to the office. It's not fair to say or assume that returning to the office is business as usual, that it's the same as it was prior to the pandemic. Many things have changed. Many people have been affected in so many different ways by the pandemic experience, whether it was personally or by extension, by being exposed to all the different things that the pandemic brought with it. So it's important to remember that as big of an adjustment as it was for everybody who had to work virtually all of a sudden, it's just as big of an adjustment to return to the office. It's not fair, and it doesn't make sense, really, to make the assumption that returning to the office is like riding a bike. Just pick up where you left off and nothing's changed, because the reality is that a great deal has changed since the pandemic first changed everybody's life. Even if things were exactly the same as they were prior to the pandemic, and maybe for some people that may be the experience in terms of returning to the office, but even if that were the case, we're not used to that anymore. We had to figure out ways of getting ourselves adjusted to working from home. So that is our new norm. That is what we're most familiar with now. So returning to the office, even if it were exactly the same, which it probably isn't, we would have to get used to it again because we've been working virtually for so long. There are certain things that initially we had to get used to in terms of having to work remotely that have now become our norm. And when we consider making a change again, we have to get used to doing things differently, even if doing things differently means going back to how things used to be, or at least similar to what they used to be before the pandemic. We're not used to working with other people and being in the same space with them. It might even feel as though they're in our space. In addition to feeling like people are in our space, we may also struggle with not getting our own way while back at the office. Let's face it, having to consider a lot of other people in our daily experience is very different than working from home. You may have worked all by yourself, been by yourself when working from home, or you may have had your family there. But whatever the situation was, chances are you have gotten used to that. You have made adjustments to make that work. Now you have to figure out how to work with your colleagues again. So those are just some of the challenges that you may be facing as you are returning back to the office, whether that's on a full-time basis or in a hybrid type of arrangement. So what does that really mean? Well, you may have to remind yourself or relearn how to interact with your colleagues. And while this might sound a little funny, because we're adults, we know how to interact with people, but you have to interact with them face to face. You have to interact with them in a professional setting. You no longer have the benefit of connecting via Zoom, which allows you for a certain distance, a certain feeling of separation. And especially when you think about having to interact with those colleagues who you may have found to be difficult to interact with, or who maybe got under your skin easily. So now you have to relearn how to deal with all that. So interacting with other people, as simplistic as this may sound, may be something that you have to relearn or remind yourself how to do in the best way as you are returning to the office. But it's not just about your colleagues. It's also you, how you behave, how you present yourself. You have to check in on yourself and remember how to conduct yourself in an office setting again. And again, that may not be a big stretch or a big difference, but there might be enough where you really have to check in on yourself and make sure that you're doing the right things. Check in on your emotions. Make sure you remember to control your emotions. You're no longer at home. You're not in your home domain. You are now at the office. So how you present yourself will likely have to be a little bit different, maybe a little more professional, maybe a little bit more controlled, held back, whatever the case may be. So that's another thing to consider. The other thing to think about are facial expressions. Now, all of us can relate to the experience of having lost the benefit of looking at somebody's face when we talk to them, because so many of us for so long have been forced to wear a face mask. And many people realize just how many cues we take from facial expressions when we communicate with one another. So it's not just the words, you hear the words, but the facial expressions are a huge contributor to our communications with one another. Now that things have gone back to a semi-normal or a normal for some, you have to remember that paying attention to those facial expressions, to those cues in other people's faces is priceless. We communicate best when we can see one another. So remember, as you're returning back to the office, you may have to pay attention to other people's facial expressions in ways that you didn't have to when everybody was covered with a mask. As you start to think about all those little things, you may realize that returning to the office can be a stressful experience. It's a transition. It's something that we need to train ourselves to get back into, that we need to ease into it. But in the meantime, all those little things that we now have to consider may be stressors to us. They may be anxiety provoking. That's why it's so important to talk about this. It's not just get back on the bike and ride like nothing ever happened, because a lot has happened since we were first forced to start working from home, to start working remotely. So as you're returning back to the office, there are many things to consider, and all of those little things can really add up to produce stress in your life or anxiety in your life. That's why it's so important to talk about it and to be aware of these things. Something else to remember is that just as returning to the office can be stressful to you, it's also stressful for other people. So while it's very important for you to recognize these potential stressors and allow yourself to ease into this now somewhat new situation of working at the office again, it's also important to give others the same benefit. Give yourself a break as you're transitioning to working back at the office, and also give others a break. Give your colleagues a break. Give the management a break. Everybody's affected by this. Some to a larger degree than others, but everybody's subject to a sort of a readjustment. So we have to be cognizant of that. Give ourselves a break. Be kind, be understanding, be patient, and extend the same courtesies to those around us. Of course, this goes beyond just the workforce. The organization has to be aware of this as well. Employers must be aware of this change, this transition, and the potential stressors and anxiety that it can bring with it. In order for everybody to get through this transition as smoothly as possible, everybody has to participate, and that means employers. In addition to simply being aware of the nature of the situation of this transition, employers must be willing and ready to provide whatever resources employees may need while transitioning to working back at the office. As you can see, something as simple as going back to working at the office, working on site, may be anything but simple. Even the little things that we now have to relearn or readjust ourselves to may be enough to collectively bring more stress and anxiety into our lives. And as a result, we have to be aware of it. We have to make sure that we respond appropriately, and employers must be part of that experience as well. As today's episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Getting back to the office is not as easy and simple as it may sound. In fact, it may be a stressful experience for many, since we may be forced to transition into a new way of doing things. Although we may have done things in that way in the past, we have since had to adjust and learn new ways of doing things. Now we have to get back to old ways of doing things, or maybe completely new ways of doing things in an old setting. So that may produce anxiety and stress. We must be aware of this. We must be kind and understanding both towards ourselves and towards others around us. And of course, employers are just as important in this experience as the workforce. Employees must be aware of this and must be able to provide benefits that employees may need, resources that employees may need. As the week unfolds, I invite you to consider your own situation. If you are planning to return to the office or already have returned to the office, be it in a full-time capacity or in a hybrid type of approach, hybrid type of arrangement, consider how that transition, how that change is affecting you or may affect you. Be kind and understanding towards yourself and those around you, and do not hesitate to invite your employer into the conversation if there are resources or benefits that you may need to help you with that transition. This is something that everybody should get in on and help each other to make this transition as smooth as possible. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I hope that you will join me again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.